I open today's seminar by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we join together and respectfully acknowledge their elders past and present, as well as any members of the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community gathered amongst us this afternoon. So this seminar series brings together a community of scientific researchers, health professionals, academics from across Victoria working within oncology and actually beyond today. My key example of our speaker. The seminar is to try and help to share the latest research activities across our partnership in Victoria internationally, and to communicate new ideas and approaches in clinical care. So today's seminar is going to cover clinical quality registries, insights and opportunities, and we're really lucky to have Professor Susannah Ahern with us. Susannah, I'm so sorry, Susannah Ahern. With us today to do that. So Susannah is a medical administrator and academic in health services research and management at Monash University. She is head of the clinical outcomes reporting and research program and a Monash academic lead for 6 national clinical quality registries. She's published over 70 peer-reviewed papers, 30 technical registry reports and a book chapter. So Professor Ahern will provide an overview of the significant activities of clinical quality registries at the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine at Monash University, and provide insights into the success and challenges associated with creating impact from clinical quality registries and discuss opportunities for the future. So Susannah, over to you.
Thanks very much, Melissa, and thank you, Hannah, for inviting me to join you today. I'm delighted to be here to talk with this group. I'll just share my screen.
Everyone else could just turn their mics off and their screens off. That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, can people see my slides pretty well?
Yep, perfect.
Yep, great. Okay. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. As you said, I've been with the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine for nearly 8 years now, and prior to that I had about 15 years experience as a medical administrator in various health services in Victoria. In terms of disclosures, I'm on a few committees, particularly relevant to registries. I do participate in a St Vincent's Health Australia board quality committee and other committees such as yourself. And I do have a number of registries funded by a range of sources. So as well as research grants, they can also be funded by Commonwealth Medical and Surgical Societies, not-for-profit and industry. So my presentation overview today is to talk a bit about the registries that we've got at the school, and then to talk a bit about the objectives in relation to registries as defined particularly by the National Strategy, the Commonwealth National Strategy for Registries, to showcase some of the impact and outputs of registries as QA activities, and to particularly highlight the different impact that they can have at different levels of maturity. To talk a little bit about CQRs as research activities, because that's after all what most of us do is research, and the types of research that we use for our CQRs, and also some thoughts throughout as well as at the end about challenges for CQRs, including emerging challenges and CQR opportunities for the future. So in terms of Monash Clinical Registries, we are the largest provider of clinical registries in the country and one of the largest in the world. We currently have about 45 clinical registries, and when I arrived at the school nearly 8 years ago, it was closer to 30. So while we do have some quite long-standing registries, we also have had continued growth of those registries over recent years. We have published a few years, I think from 2016 to 2020, we've published a Monash Clinical Registries report, which you can download from our website if you're interested, which provides a sort of standardised set of information, just like a registry, about each of our registries. And I just wanted to show that in addition to cancer registries, we've got a broad variety of registries. Some of these are ones that I oversee, such as the Australian Pelvic Floor Procedure Registry and the Australian Breast Device Registry. and I've also been involved in some of the cancer registries early on. And just to show a little bit more about cancer-specific registries. So again, these are school cancer registries. So I know that there are also some registries, say in the CCS, part of the precinct here, and also within other areas of the university. But just in terms of those 45 clinical registries at the school, there are, I think, about 10 cancer registries that we manage. So 7 of them, I think, have fallen under John Salzberg's area. So they're the Prostate Cancer Outcomes Registry, which is quite a long-standing registry, I think a bit over 10 years, maybe 10, 12 years. Bowel Cancer Outcomes Registry, which is a new version of the BCCA, an audit activity. A recent melanoma clinical outcomes registry, a lung cancer registry, an upper GI cancer registry, and an ovarian cancer registry, and the Australian and New Zealand thyroid cancer registry, which I actually set up a few years ago. We also have hematology cancers as well. So we have a myeloma registry and a lymphoma registry that are under the oversight of Professor Erica Wood. And we also do activities to support the Australian mesothelioma registry from our occupational environmental health group. So a number of people involved in a number of high profile registries. Most of these are national level registries. So I'm going to assume a small level of knowledge about registries and talk a little bit about what registries are and how they work. So this is a classic diagram of the data improvement feedback cycle, and registries really, clinical quality registries in particular, really aim to use data for clinical improvement, and essentially they're prospective cohort studies to a certain extent, where data is collected, observational data is collected, so there's no intervention in a classic registry. Observational data is collected and entered, usually at the time of diagnosis of a condition or at the time of a procedure. And it's collected either by the health service or by the clinician or others at the health service, or by data collectors that may be external to the health service. That data is collected, as well as information about diagnosis. There's information around clinical practice and outcomes, so that may be collected. Some of that may be collected at the same time. Usually some information collected relevant to risk adjustments, so around patient factors or around disease factors. And then there may be information collected at various other time points in the future. So for a surgical registry, it may be just postoperative outcomes that are collected. For medical registries, you may have annual functional data or functional information collected. Then that information is collected in a standardized way using a standardized form and or a standardized database and submitted to a central source. For our registries, it's submitted here to individual databases at the school. The data is aggregated and analysed, and we produce reports. So first lot of reports that we produce are annual reports, so they're public reports that really show information about the cohort that you're reporting on and its features, as well as information, particularly over time, about the common practices, any changes in trends or practices associated with the cohort, and outcomes, including earlier and late outcomes related to the cohort. Then when the data, also the registry can produce, when it's got sufficient volume and sufficient sites participating, it can produce clinician reports. So they will often report similar overall trends and findings in the annual report, but at a clinician or at a site or surgeon site or health service level about the demographic characteristics, about clinical practice techniques and how that may relate to expectations around clinical guidelines from the clinical guidelines and around outcomes. And increasingly that's including not only clinical outcomes, but patient-reported outcomes. The idea is that those reports maybe go to a clinician or a site once or twice a year. They use that as high quality feedback to inform their practice. And the idea is that where we might see variation, particularly in processes of care or outcomes of care, the idea is that over time, we see less and less variation as that feedback continues to those sites. So that's the basic premise of a clinical quality registry. They have been supported by the Commonwealth and the Commission for a number of years, and one of the most relevant documents to now is a 2020-2030 document that the Commonwealth Department of Health produced, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. I do get asked a lot, so as I said, there's still a lot of interest in registries, and I do get asked a lot because I have developed a number of registries. How do you set up a registry? So I've got just a little snapshot from one slide here of what are some of the key things we think about when people come and ask us. I've got this great idea. I really think it's important that we have a registry for such and such. You know, what do I need to do? What's the process? So the first thing really is about why do you need a registry? What's the high priority reason? Because the reality is there's many diseases, procedures, drugs that could have a registry. So why is it that yours is particularly important? And I guess for national funding particularly, they consider that high burden, high cost and high variability are some of the key criteria to be associated with registries that they would like to fund. Now, not all registries are funded by the Commonwealth. Some might be funded by not-for-profits, such as Movember and some of those bigger not-for-profits, or some might be funded by clinician colleges, etc. And so there may be other reasons for determining a criteria for registry, but often it's those sort of characteristics. Then I call these the critical success factor, the sort of critical success factor triad. One is funding. So I don't set up a registry unless I've got 2 to 3 years funding, because there's a lot of work goes into setting it up unless you know that you've got some initial funding to at least get it off the ground as a pilot, and then to ask for potentially more funding down the track. I also ask for individual clinician leadership. You know, sometimes I get requests from maybe pharma, for example, about setting up a registry, and it's like, well, I need the clinicians to lead it, and I need, you know, individual clinicians who are prepared to put in time and do a lot of the work to help set it up. And then the third thing is, because these are national activities, we really want every member of those craft groups that manage those conditions eventually to be involved in these registries. So we do need college and society support. And that's not always a given, but you know, where we have the college, a college member, like a senior college member endorsing, or a member on the steering committee of the registry, you know, is a very sends a very strong signal to those professionals that the registry is really important. We also need to identify and engage other key stakeholders. So they may be members of particular consumer groups, or other stakeholders such as the TGA, the Commission, or other experts in various ways, genetics expert or other sort of professional experts. And so we then pull together, once we've got funding and we've got an idea of what the registry is about, we can pull together a steering committee. Then we develop, like with most research, a protocol around really how the registry will undertake its activities. And then what we do, which is a bit different from other research, is we develop a purpose-built minimum data set and clinical indicators. Ideally, so what ideally we would do is we would have a look around at the literature around what is best practice for that particular disease or condition. We would do an academic exercise with clinicians and other experts around what are the key things that are important to measure, and processes and outcomes to determine best practice and best clinical care, and that lead to best outcomes, and then we would determine a data set around that. So it's a structured data set that's built for an initial purpose around quality improvement. And as we know, most data sets in hospitals are not built around quality improvement. And then really when we get to this stage, we think, okay, what's the infrastructure we need to collect this data? And I do find that sometimes people say to me, oh, I want to set up a registry. What database or what data platform should I use? And really, from my perspective, the selection of data collection and data management tool is something that you do, you know, almost when you're ready to get to go. It's really not about the data collection tool from my perspective. It's about all the other things. It's about all the engagement, about all the thinking around why are you doing this? What are you hoping to get out of it? who is this going to be important to? Because ultimately you will need to sustain that registry through ongoing funding, and you need to make sure you're setting up something from the very beginning that's going to be useful to people, and especially people with money, that can help you keep that going. And then, of course, as for anything, we need to set up research governance, ethics approvals. Most of our registries have an opt-out consent, which means that patients are notified about the registry and they can choose to opt out. And we do see differences in opt-out rates for different registries, which to me suggests that that process works. That, you know, some registries you would expect to have a lower or higher opt-out rate. We see that. Nevertheless, again, as many of you would know who do multi-site studies, multi-site ethics and governance is a very significant time burden for people who are setting that up. So that's one of the time constraints, especially if we want national coverage for a registry. I'll just talk a little bit about the National CQR Strategy that's been set up by the Commonwealth Department of Health, and some of the what that's about, and a little bit about the Commission, the Australian Healthcare Commission of Safety and Quality, their framework and the revision that's undergoing currently. So this national strategy is called Maximising the Value of Australia's Clinical Quality Outcomes Data, the National Strategy for Clinical Quality Registries and Virtual Registries 2020-2030. So it's a 10-year strategy, which we're 3 years in, and it really is about recognising that there are a lot of existing registries and data sets. In fact, the Commission, and I know Cass is here, hi Cass, from the Commission. The Commission's done has got a curated a number of activities that call themselves clinical registries, and there's over 100 in Australia. So we have a lot of activity going on, and the Commonwealth and the Commission are working together to maximise the value from that. So supporting registry activities in a number of tangible ways, including through funding, but also looking at what are some of the barriers to really getting the most out of that data. And in particular, what they see is really important is in the longer term, and I do agree with this, that what we want is that we want clinical quality registry data to be integrated as part of national, state and territory, but also health system data. We want the data that we produce to go back to health services and to be used. We want it to go back to state and territory governments and to be used for planning and improvement purposes. So we don't want it to be sitting on a shelf. We don't want it to be stuck in our database. We want it to be used. And so this strategy recognises that there's all this great data out there. How do we make sure that it's good quality and useful for improving patient outcomes? So that was on the previous slide, it was a message from the Minister of Health as part of the forward of the strategy. And just to show again that these are what they consider to be the priority areas, those areas with the greatest burden of disease and cost to the Australian healthcare system, greatest variation and/or greatest variation in care and outcomes. So in particular, the strategy has supported registries associated with cardiovascular disease, associated with musculoskeletal disorders such as spine surgery. Cancer registries are part of the strategy as well, or part of one of the high priority areas. Dementia is a high priority area, diabetes is a high priority area. So there's some of the sorts of things, registries that we've got that are supported by Commonwealth funding. This is a key sort of table in relation to the strategy, and as with most strategies, you sort of have your key priority areas, your vision, and that's really again about integrating the data, information and systems to drive patient-centred improvement, to achieve better patient outcomes across the healthcare system. So under your vision, you've got some particular pillars or priority areas, and there's sort of three main groups of these. The first one is really around patient-centeredness. So what clinical quality registries, were initially developed by clinicians for clinicians. They're increasingly being developed by and for clinicians and consumers, or patients for clinicians and consumers. And so just making sure that that the registries are patient-centred and get that patient input and patient feedback and can inform patients is a really important part of the strategy, as it should be. And that reflects the way we do clinical care now. Then there's a set of priorities around standardisation and efficiency. So that's really around making sure the registry operates as efficiently as possible and with high quality, so that there's appropriate mechanisms, especially around things such as patient consent and recruitment, that the data sets are minimal and low burden as possible, and that we use appropriate technologies where we can to collect those. And that there's financial sustainability is really around understanding the beneficiaries of registries and ultimately looking for co-funders together with the Commonwealth or together with a main funder to support registries to ensure that they're sustainable, because they do collect data year on year about the same patients in the long-term cohort or about new patients in a quick turnover cohort. And then thirdly, and it's around innovation impact. So really thinking about transparency and impact. So transparency and access, is really about using the data, making sure the data gets used for a whole range of secondary purposes. And then linkage, integration and interoperability is largely about, again, trying to utilise existing infrastructure where possible for maximum efficiency and impact. And the national strategy, again, recognises and identifies a whole range of stakeholders. So again, I think different to some of the research that we do, where we primarily have a group of academics and associated clinicians. These really note that the key stakeholders include consumers and their carers in some instances, and also regulators and industry. We've got the TGA is becoming an increasingly strong advocate for clinical registries as post-marketing surveillance tools. Since I've been working with them on the breast device and the pelvic mesh registry, you realise what an impossible job it is to, from their point of view, to capture accurate post-market data about millions of different devices and things that are out there and constantly get added. And wherever there's a registry that collects high quality data, it's just such an important source of information for them. We've talked about governments, health insurers. I believe will have a greater role in supporting registries. Certainly, private healthcare contributes to, many types of healthcare delivery, and we know in the cancer space it contributes at least 50%, and some instances more. And yet private health insurers have had very little role in the financing of registries. And then the research sector, which includes many people I've got here. So again, using that data to drill down on it, to ask specific research questions, as well as to link to other data sets and get further insights into the data that way. So I mentioned some of the sort of high volume, high risk activities or high burden activities that the Commonwealth Strategy funds. And for the first time, we have a line item in this year's federal budget about a national registry program, and that included 4-year funding for 12 registries, of which the school was a recipient of funding for a majority of those, I think about 8 of those. Funding for some implementation pilot projects, so particularly those that continue to support the sector and to support best practice in the sector. And we've been told as well next year there'll be seed funding for some additional registries. The strategy does also highlight that there are some key challenges. So particularly the strategy recognises what I mentioned before, when you do any multi-site research or data collection activity, there's a huge ethics and governance burden. The data collection itself, whether it's done by data collectors or done in hospitals, even though we try and make it the minimal data sets, that can still be quite complex, especially for areas such as cancer. Interoperability remains challenging because most of the data items in registries don't, that registries seek to use to measure quality and outcomes, don't exist in existing EMRs. And also the fact that the participation in clinical quality registries is voluntary. So although some people think, for example, the joint replacement registry is a compulsory, it's not actually compulsory. It's just been going for about 25 years or so, and so most people participate in it. They find it, the cost benefit of participation is sufficiently good that over that period of time that people choose to participate. So we don't have a mandatory participation model, and that's the case in most countries. And even if they do have mandatory participation, enforcing that can be difficult. But there are some enablers for registries. So particularly over the last decade or so, the Commission and its requirements for accreditation of health services have areas around variation of care and expectations that health service will monitor variations of care and review data and data and information on process of care and outcomes of care to make improvements. And they recognise that registry is an important role for health services to do that. There are also clinician CPD requirements, and increasingly, and in fact, starting this year in 2023, there's an increased requirement. I think about half the CPD points for clinicians require a review of clinical data. And again, if you have a registry that you participate in, that pretty much enables you to meet those audit requirements, or those MBA requirements. There are also increasing expectations and support also from the community and for not-for-profit sectors. So, as I mentioned, the Pelvic Floor Registry was set up after a Senate inquiry, and there's very strong community participation in that to make sure that that registry monitors future practices and does not result in the sort of outcomes that those women suffered. And also with not-for-profits, I've particularly been involved in liaising with a number from rare disease areas. And, they just say that there's no data out there, no standardised data to even understand how many patients have got some of their diseases, when they're diagnosed, what's their functional trajectory, what's the mortality rates like. But there's just so little data around that sort of useful information for them to be able to advocate for research, because they just don't have that starting information. And then regulatory bodies, as I mentioned. The Commission has also been really a very strong leader of registries, and they in particular have developed a set of sort of preliminary documents to standards, the first being the framework for Australian clinical quality registries. So they partnered with Monash Uni in 2008 for the first framework. There was a second in 2014, and there's currently a third version in development that started around 2021 and is aiming to be finished later this year. And I'm on the expert advisory group for this, and we were presented with a version last year, a version of this third version, revision. There was some public consultation earlier this year that's gone back to the to the Commission to continue to work on, and we're expecting something further from that later in the year. And while those documents are very detailed, in general, the framework structure has been and will continue to be a set of strategic principles around registries, some operating principles, and then some quality expectations. And these will, in certain areas, particularly around governance of registries, so who's on the steering committee, who makes decisions around access to data, what's data governance like, etc. Information about the collection of data, how data is held, data management expectations, and increasingly around data security expectations, and also expectations about how we report the data to various stakeholders and how we monitor variation. So there's some of the sort of high-level elements of the framework. So I'm just going to present some data from some information from some of the registries that I'm involved with. So one of the things is I wanted to highlight with registries is that we really try and make impact at all the different stages of registry development. And from my experience of setting up and managing registries over the last 8 years or so, I've sort of identified 3 phases, and this is sort of consistent with some literature around this as well. But there's an early phase or an establishment phase where you do those activities we saw to set up the registry, and then you start collecting the data. And every time you approach a health service and get them involved, you're establishing a community of practice, really, of clinicians involved in that disease or that undertake that procedure. And usually by the end of 3 years, you've got maybe 20 or 30 sites for a substantial registry that are contributing. You've got sufficient data that you can produce your first annual report, so that you've got an understanding of your diagnostic patient profile and your sort of commencing cohort. In the consolidation phase, usually somewhere between around 4 and 10 years, you're starting to collect not only that initial data from patients, but also some sort of follow-up data, whether it's a sort of short surgical follow-up data or sort of annual follow-up data, potentially for some of the medical registries. And so then you're starting to feed that data back to health services and clinicians, and they're starting to be able to see their data benchmarked compared to others in terms of their practices and processes of care and their outcomes. And so we do that. We start to see the variation that's initially quite high because people don't know how they compare to others, and over time we see that variation decrease. And then in the mature phase, it's really about what those goals of the registry strategy are. It's really about having a very mature, high quality data sets, being able to integrate those within the various health systems, that they're used at health service level, they're used to inform practice, they're potentially used to support patient and clinician shared decision making. And they're also used extensively for research. So just to highlight some examples, so one of my newer registries is the Australian Pelvic Floor Procedure Registry. This was a registry that was quite politically sensitive. It was a registry that had representatives from a few different craft groups. We've got urologists, urogynecologists, general gynecologists, and we've also got a colorectal surgeon involved because we're thinking about adding rectopexy procedures. So there's been a big lot of work to engage over the first couple of years, clinicians from different craft groups to set expectations around what we're collecting, how we're going to collect it, how we're going to report it to clinicians from those different craft groups. And also working really closely with with consumers, 2 committees, 2 on the steering committee. We've got a consumer reference group now. We've got consumer webinars where we talk about the registry and involving consumers as well in discussions about PROMs and PREMs, etc. We recently had an interesting experience where we undertook a pilot of patient-reported outcomes on a particular tool that were, approved by through some research and with clinicians, and we fed that back to our patient reference group, and they recommended some slight tweaks to what we were doing there, which we've been happy to do. So, and that was just at the early stage. So now we can roll out those PROMs, having had that, really good feedback. Another registry that's been going for a few years as well, still relatively recent and only recently received some Commonwealth funding, is the Spine Surgery Registry. So this meets the criteria of high cost, high burden. And one of the things that this registry has been doing since the very beginning is it's been collecting PROMs, and it's been very successful at collecting high response rates for its PROMs at around 85%, and even up to nearly up to 80% by 24 months. And, we report those back in our annual reports, for example, showing the difference between a preoperative PROM, such as this one for lumbar surgery, and postoperative scores, which have clearly shifted to the left, which in this instance is a sign of improvement. And we also collect information about the different scales on the PROMs tools, and can therefore see particularly what things lead to the most improvements compared to other things that have had less improvement. And we'll be reporting those back at individual clinician levels and benchmarking them as well. So even though something relatively new, it's only got 3,500 patients, it's able to provide some pretty compelling data about the effectiveness of the procedures. In terms of consolidation phase, I manage the Australian Breast Device Registry, and it's had been reporting annual and site reports, I think, since 2016. So we're doing our 7th year of reporting this year. It's a paper form with a tick and stick, although we're turning it into a database as I speak, for direct data entry. It's a very big registry, 300 sites, public, the vast majority private, close to 600 surgeons, I think, by now. We've now got over 100,000 procedures, and it's we talked about different clinician groups. It's a mix of cosmetic and plastic surgeons, and so they're not a group that have tended to work together a lot. So, having different craft groups and bringing them together to do the same activity, I think, has been, one of the successes of this registry. And just to show you in terms of the sorts of things you can do at this stage, so we've been able to monitor trends in procedures. So, for example, we've got reconstructive surgery here and cosmetic. And one of the things here is we've got insertion procedures, revision procedures, and explant procedures. And because of some raising awareness around a rare lymphoma that can be associated with breast implants, we're seeing increasing percentage of procedures being explants. We also have been able to monitor device trends in different types of procedures. So, for example, in reconstructive procedures, there's two types of procedures mainly. One is a direct implant and one is a two-stage insertion where there's a tissue expander first. And while that two-stage insertion was, slightly more common for the first few years, we've seen during the time of this that direct-to-implant has taken over as the most popular. And we're just doing our 2022 data analysis at the moment. So it has implications for the sort of complication and other profile. These two things have different profiles of complications. So changing trends like this will impact on patients overall clinically. And definitely the BIA ALCL lymphoma was known to be associated, or is thought to be associated with textured implants. It's not been known to be associated with any smooth implants. So we have seen in the registry during this time, together with the regulation of the TGA, a dramatic drop in the use of textured implants and a much greater increase in the use of smooth implants. And I must say this is a much more significant change than what we've seen in the Dutch breast implant registry, which has seen a much slighter change. I think the regulatory changes have not been as significant as ours, but there are still no examples of the lymphoma in smooth implants. So I'm very happy to see that smooth implant rate continuing to increase. We've also can look at matrix or no matrix and the different survival or different revision rates, and again by shell type. So we've got in particular there was a type of shell polyurethane which was supposed to be associated with. We've seen here a higher incidence as well after a number of years. In terms of mature phase registries, one that I have the privilege to manage, we took it over in 2016, but it was established in 1996 and started collecting data in 1998. It is Cystic Fibrosis Registry. We produce an annual report, an annual infographic and site reports. We report information about genotypes because the drugs are targeted towards genotypes. So we have drop-down libraries in our databases that are updated regularly with information from Johns Hopkins University about the different genotypes as they become known that are associated with CF. And then we also report our data completeness, including back to sites. So as you can see, the younger people diagnosed have got nearly all of them have got both of their known alleles genotyped, whereas in the earlier it wasn't so available. So we report this back to sites so that they can try and maximise overall the proportion of patients that are fully genotyped, so that they've got the opportunity to access some of these new disease modifying treatments. During COVID, we collected information about whether patients were seen via telehealth or via face-to-face, and what happened in 2020 was there were a complete shift. So basically, this started off from January to 2020 completely dark orange, and then by I think from about March or April it completely flipped and it was all completely light orange. And then what happened in 2021 is we've had a settling down where there remains use of telehealth generally as part of a hybrid model for CF centres. So generally about 2/3 of patients are having a hybrid model where it's a mix of face-to-face and telehealth. And here we're doing some post-market surveillance reporting for the TGA or in relation to these new disease-modifying treatments. And we've been, as you can see, they've had like models of car. You get a first model of a car, it's okay. Then you get the second model, and gradually by the time you've got your sort of fourth, fifth model of the car, everyone wants to have it because all the little bugs and things have been worked out. Really interestingly, these new disease-modifying treatments, the effect they have in outcomes is just remarkable. And I know it's the case often with the new cancer drug, but for example, we used to pretty consistently have around 40 bilateral lung transplants a year. That's completely dropping. I'll be interested to see what our 2022 data is, but it's gone from about 40 to about 10 in 2021, and we're hearing stories of sites that just hardly do them anymore. And likewise, survival has gone up from around 45 or so to nearly to heading towards 60 because of these disease-modifying drugs. Now, if you said to someone 20 years ago the average life expectancy of someone with CF would be nearly 60 by now, they wouldn't believe you. It's just been remarkable to be a part of that. And we report, as I said, back to sites, information about their site compared to others. So this is, for example, is the number of visits, where 4 visits a year is estimated to be the gold standard. So your site compared to others, and number of hospitalizations, where there may be a range of factors relating to those, but they can look at their hospitalizations and consider, the proportion having 0 is about 60, and this site's a bit less, so they've got more hospitalizations overall. So whether they're being particularly careful or whether their patients are sicker, something for them to investigate. Registries, many registries also have international registries as well. So we're very lucky, again, as CF, it's been around for a long time. There's a fantastic community, international community of CF registries, of which we are one, and there's some great studies we can do together. Just for the last few minutes, I'll talk a little bit about the sort of research activities we can do with registries. So there's I think of it as 2 types of research. One is your sort of clinical and or health services research, which is your sort of typical research you would expect to do when you collect clinical data. And the other is, what I'm particularly interested in, is I don't have a clinical specialty, is CQR methodological research. So that's around trying to understand and find best ways to undertake CQR activities. So, for example, in clinical and health services research, some of the research we've done has been in using the CF registry, and we also have done some research using our dementia registry, even though it's still quite new. We've developed some indicators and we've tested some of those out, through ROSA, which is a state-based data set, and also use data linkage to emulate what our data set could look like with our particular cohort. So this was using it for an aged care cohort, but we looked at those indicators to see how they would work, whether they may be suitable for our cohort with just dementia, patients diagnosed with dementia. So again, trying to do that discipline-specific research to improve that field. And then really in terms of methods research, there's a whole lot of stuff that we try and do with every registry we've got. Developing frameworks for reporting PROMs in registries, because PROMs originally have been used for either clinical care or for clinical trials, and including them in registries, interestingly, there's quite a few elements that need consideration in terms of how are they reported. Are they reported in an identified or de-identified way to sites? Because I might not have mentioned, but most registries collect identified data so we can follow the patients up. There's a whole, and what sort of response rates are meaningful for registries, for example, for PROMs. There's often editorials about we need to do something to fix ethics and governance. Again, with PROMs, how do we benchmark PROMs? So benchmark PROMs, how do we risk adjust for PROMs? There's very little, data out there. Do we need to do it differently than we would do it for clinical data? How do we collect comorbidities, patient surveys versus clinician surveys, which is the worst for surgeons anyway, or using existing data such as MDS or PDS data. And we've done a bit of work around using registries for clinical trials as well, which is something we're very interested in continuing to progress. So lastly, in terms of some emerging challenges. So I sort of think of these again as things that are outside our control to a certain extent and things that we can address. So I think things that are outside our control, we certainly can work with stakeholders, but what I'm finding is as we seek to identify more and more beneficiaries of our registries, then there are people who are interested in coming on board, potentially interested in funding. They may have their own particular goals for the registry, and so it's about trying to manage, not only managing large groups of different types of clinicians, but also potentially various stakeholders and funders and what their expectations might be, and including consumers as well. The data quality and completeness, everyone knows that there's the data missingness is a feature of registries because we're not funded to the same extent as clinical trials in terms of having individuals at every health services entering the data that's paid. So verification or audit processes are quite important, but they're also costly and expensive, and sometimes there is no benchmark. For example, on breast devices for cosmetic purposes, there is no MBS item. Cybersecurity and data infrastructure costs are things that we're increasingly finding are quite significant cost burdens on our registries that tend to be things that no one really wants to pay for, but to do this properly, it's nevertheless needed. And financial sustainability. I think at the moment we're very lucky with some of our registries that they have got good relationships with a range of funders, but including the Commonwealth. But it is always registries are long-term things, and they will need long-term funding. And there's always a little bit of a challenge. No funding is secure past the current contract, and also getting funds for research to work with registries. I think being in a school where we do lots of clinical trials, it is easier through the MRFF to fund clinical trials. The MRFF says they don't fund registries except when they do, which is, seems to be quite political or quite sort of special. But in general, if you put in funding for a registry in the MRFF, they will say they won't fund it. And methodological challenges include about things really around the methodology. We really are interested in exploring and developing and continually improving our methodology. How do we make the registry reports even more attractive to sites so that they really can use them really effectively for quality and quality? How do we show that there's benefit from a registry? I can show those graphs where there's been improvement in outcomes or changes in practice, and how much of that is due to the registry monitoring and reporting back, and how much of that is due to other factors. It's a difficult study to do. And cost effectiveness, again, similar concepts. What are the real costs of registries when people are putting in data in kind versus a sort of fully costed clinical trial? And I think this is my last slide. There are lots of opportunities though. I think really trying to work closely with health services, because I think they can really, they haven't, a lot of them don't know what registries they participate in, and there's really much more we can do to provide the information that registries have to the health service leadership. I would love to see more of our registries use the data in a predictive modelling sort of way. So a patient who arrives to a surgeon or a clinician with a particular disease, got a certain risk factors, they can be given some predictive information based on contemporary Australian data. Feedback to jurisdictions for service planning. Academics, unless they're in that area, don't tend to think about service planning and service policy, but there is really a lot of opportunity there to interact with those areas of governance. Integration, we're starting to see AIHW approaches about potentially capturing some of our data and having them enduring data sets in AIHW, which is fantastic. We then have to go back to our consent models and have a look in our steering committee and see what sort of concerns people may or may not have about that. Registry-based trials, we've got some questions there that we'd like to explore further to really get a handle on the best way to run and appropriate utility for registry-based trials. High-cost treatments and devices we're already doing. There's a lot of potential in that area. I don't think some of these registries have to go on forever. I think they could be quite short-term registries when a new device comes out that's quite costly to support its cost benefit. But maybe we don't need those registries to go on forever, because that's what sometimes concerns funders. And I'm also interested in the concept of actually seeing if we can use registries to identify low-value care as well. We're very focused on registries identifying best practice and high-value care, but can we also use them to identify low-value care and to assist in sort of disinvestment practices there? So I think I've used up my 45 minutes. So I just want to say thank you very much for having me. I hope you found some of that useful and applicable to your areas.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susannah. Amazing journey across the breadth of something that we probably don't all sit in the context of, but wonderful to hear about it in that sort of detail. If anyone has a question for Susannah, please just turn your screen on, or Anthony. There you go. First up. And
G'day. Thanks for that, Susannah. That was really quite insightful. I'm particularly interested in drug resistance for cancer patients. Are you aware, are there any registries that track the emergence of resistance to like targeted therapies within some of those cancer registries that you mentioned?
Look, I think it could be possible, particularly in the haematology ones. I know that, like me, they're also working with pharma to monitor outcomes from their drugs. So resistance could be one of the outcomes that they're monitoring. I think the John Salzberg's ones are a bit more the surgical type, but I think it'd be worth certainly reaching out to Erica and possibly John as well. Yep.
Do you think,
I don't know.
Well, do you think that seems like the kind of thing that a registry could be used for? Because I do find it kind of difficult to find data about people actually progressing in drug resistance. It's sort of like everyone acknowledges that it exists, but no one really collects any data on it. Do you think that would fit this kind of framework?
Well, it could. Certainly when we have the cystic fibrosis registry, we monitor patients who are on these drugs and we monitor their reason for discontinuation. So I'm not aware of drug resistance being an issue for those drugs, but if it is an issue for other drugs, it could be a reason for discontinuation. And so, that might be some way you could collect that data, I would have thought.
Cool. Oh, well, thank you so much.
Jenny.
Hi there. My name's Jenny, and I work with the Australasian Leukemia and Lymphoma Group, and I work on the National Blood Cancer Registry. So just a quick mention. Well, hi Susannah. Thanks for a fantastic talk, and just to mention as well in response to the previous query that we do capture response post-treatment for a number of different disease groups within hematological malignancies. But Susannah, I just wanted to ask, with the kind of expansion in the availability of genetic testing surrounding in particular hematological malignancies, probably other cancers as well, where do you see in terms of the future of data collection, where we might move away from traditional EDC platforms that aren't really designed to capture that volume of data, if the expansion in like molecular markers, MRD monitoring is within that minimum data set to be captured in the EDC? Where do you kind of see that going?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, as we head into personalised medicine, we do need to collect much more of that sort of really high storage sort of data. So look, I guess I know that we've got a genomics platform at the school that I understand is a database set up to collect that sort of data, and certainly biomarkers and biorepositories and other things are things that some of the cancer type registries are interested in doing. So I agree. I think we should always make sure what we collect is the most clinically relevant information. I don't know enough about what you're talking about to be able to advise you specifically, but I do think if that's what's most relevant to treatment, that's what needs to be collected. So we need to find a way to do that.
Great, thanks, Susannah.
Yeah, it's a huge package, and actually I think a lot of registries and research resources are really grappling with how to manage that sort of data. It's really important to capture, but it's has this burden of requiring curation and infrastructure that perhaps not everyone is sitting on. That makes it easy to do, but a really important frontier, I think. Sorry to sort of answer your question, Susannah.
Oh, we agree, that's fine.
Thank
To
you.
remember why I've got my camera on. Sorry. Okay, we've probably got 1 minute left. Does anyone else have anything else for Susannah? Okay, well, I think it's left to me to thank you very much for an amazing seminar. Great to have you in a forum of a cancer setting and to actually have you on the advisory committee of the MPCCC. So thank you very much for making all of those contributions. And thanks everyone for attending. The next seminar is on July 18th and is going to be delivered by Associate Professor Misty Jenkins. So those details will be available via the usual processes and also on the website. So I hope we can see many of you again on the 18th. But thank you very much, Susannah, again, and
Thank you,
everyone.
Pleasure.
Thanks very much. Thank you.